Well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the celebration and commemoration of the Mayflower Compact. Today is the 21st of November, 2020. We celebrate the 400th anniversary on the new style calendar. The old style would have been November 11th, but with the adjustment from the Julian to the Gregorian calendar, it is now on the 21st. And our purpose here is to commemorate and remember those who brought self-government to our shores. Many people have heard of the Mayflower Compact, but very few people really understand what it means. And over the, I'm going to say last several decades, I think the real meaning of the compact has been lost. What we're trying to do is to rectify that to a great degree today. We stand here in front of the relief underneath the Pilgrim Monument in Provincetown. Right off of the shores here, the Mayflower happened to be anchored when they discovered they were off of Cape Cod instead of their destination down in what was the northern reaches of Virginia, present-day mouth of the Hudson River. And it was as close as we can possibly get, without being in the water, to being at the actual spot 400 years ago where the compact was signed. What I would now like to do is just share a few remarks, talk about the genesis of the compact, interrelated with the story of the settlers, the separatists, and the pilgrims and those that came along with them, why they did what they did, and how it developed into the colony and how it developed into a migration much later on that formed the kernel of what became the United States of America. The English Reformed Church and English common law tradition had developed and met, influencing generations that were going to have impacts greatly on both sides of the Atlantic in the English-speaking world. The rise of the Tudor Dynasty in the aftermath of the fratricidal medieval War of the Roses, Henry VII becomes king, ushers in a new era, the Tudor Dynasty. His son, Henry VIII, ushered in a new era when he had separated the English Church from the Roman Catholic Church, creating the Anglican Church. It was a very political and administrative move as opposed to a theological one, unlike the Reformation taking part on the continent. His young son, Edward VII, helped support the growing Reformation. Even though he was young and his ministers he had around him, people who were later become separatists and Puritans had a lot of sympathy with this particular court. However, in this growing English awakening, the young king suddenly dies, and his oldest sister, Mary I, becomes Queen of England. Mary's a Roman Catholic. She marries Philip III of Spain, and there's a great influence there from the Spanish court. What happened during this period of time? Many of these separatists discovered that they were no longer welcome here in the shores. In London itself, a great underground church had developed, numbering into the thousands, and the entire establishment at the point seemed to be against them. 1693, there was an act that banished them all from the shores of England, or they were to conform. Of course, many of them would not do so. However, many of them did go into exile. Many of the leaders went into exile in Geneva, where at the time the theologian John Calvin had held sway, and it was there that the first Bible completely translated in English, the Geneva Bible, came into prominence. Within a few years, this was 1560, within a few years later, Mary dies, and her younger sister, Edward's other sister, Elizabeth I, becomes queen. She reverses polity yet in another direction, going back to the Anglican Church, but now there's great confusion because half of the Anglican bishops seem to be sympathetic to the Puritans and the separatists. The other half, very, very antagonistic. During this period of confusion, many of the churches that had sprung up in England and stayed in England, like the Scrooby congregation that gave birth to our settlers here, started to flourish. However, after the turn of the century, early 1600s, Queen Elizabeth dies. After that, her kinsman, her nearest kinsman at the time, James I Stuart, James VI of Scotland becomes the king. Suddenly, many things start to happen. One of which, in Scrooby, the Archbishop of York, who William Brewster had served as his father had, Matthew Hutton, passed away. A new archbishop takes over and starts to strictly enforce the Conformity Acts. They find themselves having to leave. That is when most went to Amsterdam, where other separatist churches had settled from England, and further to Leiden, when those churches started to get into schism and separate out from each other. One thing to remember is this group of Englishmen never stopped being English. They were there in exile. Two things about them being in exile. They didn't have the freedoms, believe it or not, they would have had in England. The church couldn't proselytize, which they couldn't at the time in England, and there were many other restrictions on them. And the long arm of James Stuart went through his kinsman, the stadtholder, William of Orange, and had persecuted the Pilgrim settlers there as well. So, that leads us up to 1619. Holland's in the middle of a war with Spain for their independence, called the 80 Years' War. About 40 years into the war, there's a truce. That truce is about to end. Any day, they were wondering if Spanish troops weren't going to embark on their settlement. And their fate at the hands of Philip IV at this point of Spain would have been much greater than even theirs at the hands of James Stuart, King of England. What were some of the inspirations behind the compact? Obviously Magna Carta, the Great Charter of 1215 that ensured the rights of freedmen, not just a special class, but all freedmen. The writings contemporary at the time were Sir Edward Coke of England and Thomas Littleton, even earlier. This had developed with them as the growing fight between king and parliament started reaching a climax. What did they do? This was also the beginning of great exploration for England. They were starting to expand into a colonial venture that the European brethren on the continent already embarked on. They were approached, and they had approached a company, the Virginia Company of London, to take part into a journey, which they did. And they were given a patent to do so. However, on the voyage, there were a number of other passengers that the company had hired to help along with the venture, not sure that they wanted to have an entire group of separatists go. Maybe a quarter of their congregation was able to make its way over. 3/4 were in Leiden. Later on, most of them would come over, but not right away. Then, after 2 false starts, they had their own ship, the Speedwell that they had chartered. Ironically, the Speedwell had been used in the Spanish Armada, and a newer ship called the Mayflower, which was a merchant ship that had carried wine largely between France and England. Speedwell broke a leak. They had to remove themselves twice, and this was in the summer of 1620. Finally, late September, they get underway. What happens? Well, they were out at sea and a vicious storm appeared. Blown way off course, after the storm subsided, making for the nearest landfall they could, anchored off of these shores in Cape Cod. They knew where they were, but they also knew there was no jurisdiction for their patent. Among the non-separatist passengers, their governor, Christopher Martin, who was also the company manager as well for the voyage, was having some trouble with some of the recalcitrant members of his group. People were starting to talk privately but loudly about there being no charter to hold them bound and they could do what they needed. Most of the rest of them, however, decided that was not wise and great folly, especially off these shores. What did they do? At this point, the Scrooby Leiden passengers, led by William Brewster and John Carver, suggested drawing up a document for government. This was readily agreed to by Christopher Martin and Stephen Hopkins. One recalcitrant, John Billington, was encouraged to sign, which he did do. Where did they get the inspiration from this? A letter to John Carver from their minister, John Robinson, had suggested to them when they landed to start a charter of self-government. That was where they had the 1620 patent from the Virginia Company of London. However, the Plymouth Company of Virginia was where they were. And that company now was in the middle of transformation. So no longer were they in another jurisdiction. That jurisdiction was now changed from the Plymouth Company of Virginia to the New England Company of Plymouth, where the company adventurers were located. Now, a new patent had to be obtained by them. It was readily done by a man named John Pierce, who had gotten the original patent in 1621. In 1629, the Bradford Patent was the finalized agreement, and both patents incorporated the compact in them for self-governance. The big thing to understand was in Virginia, the company appointed the governor and a governor's council. 1619, they had the famous House of Burgesses, which still exists in the House of Delegates of Virginia today, but that was the legislative body. Here with the compact, all officers were chosen by the people here. What I like to do is just read for a moment from some of the scriptures that they used as inspiration. I'm going to read from Deuteronomy verses 18 through 20. Judges and officers shalt thou make thee in all thy cities, which the Lord thy God hath given thee throughout the tribes, and they shall judge the people with righteous judgment. Rest not thy law, nor respect any persons, neither take reward, for reward blindeth the eyes of the wise, and perverteth the words of the just. That which is just and right shall thou follow, that thou mayest live and possess the land which the Lord thy God giveth thee. If I could ask my friend there to hand me my booklet. Thank you. What I like to do is read that letter their pastor James Robertson had sent them. The last part of that letter read to John Carver, lastly, whereas you are become a body politic, using amongst yourselves civil government, and are furnished with any persons of special eminency above the rest, not furnished, to be chosen by you in the office of government, let your wisdom and godliness appear, not only in choosing such persons as do eminently love and will promote the common good, but also in yielding to them all due honor and obedience in their lawful administrations, not beholding in them the ordinaries of their persons, but God's ordinance for your own good, not being like the foolish multitude, who more honor the gay coat than either the virtuous mind of the man or glorious ordinance of the Lord. But you know better things, that the image of the Lord's power and authority beareth is honorable. In how mean persons soever, and his duty, you both made a more willingly and ought the more conscionably to perform, because you are at least for the present to have only them for your ordinary governors, which yourselves shall make choice of for that work. As we listen to the Mayflower Compact, listen to the words of the letter and listen to what came before, because you will see how it reaches out to what they did, what came before, and then what came after. Reading as follows. In ye name of God, amen, whose names are underwritten by the loyal subjects of our dread sovereign, Lord King James, by ye grace of God of Great Britain, France, and Ireland, King of ye faith, having undertaken for ye glory of God and advancement of ye Christian faith, and honor of our king and country, a voyage to plant ye first colony in ye northern parts of Virginia, do by these present solemnly and mutually in ye presence of God and of one another, covenant and combine ourselves together into a civil body politic, for our better ordering and preservation and furtherance of ye ends aforesaid, by virtue hereof to enact, constitute, and frame such just and equal laws, ordinances, acts, constitutions, and offices from time to time, as shall be thought most meet and convenient for ye general good of ye colony, unto which we promise all due submission and obedience. In witness whereof we have hereunder subscribed our names at Cape Cod, ye 11th of November, in ye year of the reign of our sovereign Lord King James of England, France, and Ireland, ye 18th, and of Scotland, ye 54th, Anno Domini 1620. Signed, John Carver, William Bradford, Edward Winslow, William Brewster, Isaac Allerton, Miles Standish, John Alden, Samuel Fuller, Christopher Martin, William Mullins, William White, Richard Warren, John Howland, Stephen Hopkins, Edward Tilley, John Tilley, Francis Cook, Thomas Rogers, Thomas Tinker, John Rigdale, Edward Fuller, John Turner, Francis Eaton, James Chilton, John Craxton, John Billington, Moses Fletcher, John Goodman, DeGurry Priest, Thomas Williams, Gilbert Winslow, Edward McGuffin, Peter Brown, Richard Bitteridge, George Soule, Richard Clark, Richard Gardner, John Ellerton, Thomas English, Edward Doughton, Edmund Lester. These are the men who are commemorated on the bas relief beyond us. Out there on those shores, they commemorated, quite possibly around this time, what became the Mayflower Compact. It is important that we take this day to remember what that compact did. It stayed with us. And it wasn't an accident it stayed with us as long as we did. It became part of the fabric of this colony and inspirations for later colonies after. We thank you for joining us here. I invite some of our fellow participants up here if they have to say a few words to do so.
I think on a day like today, where in 2020, much of what was historically planned to happen did not happen. I'm here today because I don't believe that the Pilgrim story should go unremarked in its 400th year. And to that end, I'd like to say a rousing 3 cheers for the intrepid people that came here and settled. So, hip hip, huzzah! Hip hip, huzzah! Hip hip, huzzah!
It's frequently said that those who don't remember history are doomed to repeat it. It would be good if this part of history is remembered so that we can continue to act in the same spirit in which they acted to establish this compact, and which led to much greater and better things.
Amen.
Everything in life begins with a first step. The colonists that came here provided that first step. They didn't know what was coming. They had no idea what the future would be for this country, for them, their family. But they took the first step. They signed a paper. They put their name to a declaration. Later, many other people would put their names to a declaration. Then we became the United States of America.
We'd like to thank you folks for joining us. Is there anybody out there that would like to say a few words or have any questions for us?
Just one question. Is the original compact at the museum in Boston?
Well, you know, there's really no original compact. The earliest extent we have is in Mort's Relation that was actually compiled in 1622. But that might be there.
That's a printed version.
Yeah.
Not the handwritten.
Yeah.
Yeah, handwritten's gone.
Yeah, that's lost.
Lost. Okay.
But they did carefully, obviously that's what they used for their documents, so they did pen it.
Yeah.
All right, we'll be here for definitely a few more minutes.